What I want to do today is to give some introduction very briefly, because of time, into some principles of brain-inspired cognitive architectures. And then I will go and present two examples, what we currently do as part of the Human Brain Project. Very, very selected work, but I hope it gives you in kind of a intuitive understanding of why we do things, what things we do, and what we learn from these enterprises. So without further ado, I want to start with the question, what are brain-inspired cognitive architectures? And the main point here is that it's a cognitive architecture like you find, for example, in robotics. But the difference is that one not only tries to be engineering smart and build modules which get tested and do certain functions, but it's important that for brain-inspired cognitive architectures, that the modules or the functions which are implemented have a relationship to the brain. So the architecture is usually inspired by the brain, but it goes beyond that. Even as we will see, the internal workings, to some extent at least, is also inspired by the brain. And even more importantly, if we do it in a brain-inspired way, we can do modeling up to robotics, for example, to develop smart systems. But a major goal which drives me as a brain scientist is that I want to learn by doing this also how the brain works. So it goes from brain knowledge into models. The models are executed, so to say, in an embodied environment. And from what they learn, how they behave, is it human-like? Is it like we expect or not? If it is, then we inspect the internal workings, what the system has learned, because we train these systems. And then we want to compare whether the representations the system has developed, the connectivity, the strengths and so on, and the kind of representations and functions, whether they resemble what we know from brain research. In that sense, the models we build, the tested models, lead, and I give you an example, often to testable predictions about brain research, which we can test then in the animal by electrical recordings, for example. But we do it in my lab, as we heard from Pavel, with brain imaging methods. So we get new hypotheses and then test them back using human brain imaging techniques. And I will show you one example where we did that recently, or we are currently working on this still, but we are now going to test what we have learned. And I will give you two examples after a few general introductory remarks, and hope that they are illustrative to the kind of work we do in the context of a science work package I'm heading in the Human Brain Project. So here, an important point. A cognitive architecture is a bit different from most deep learning AI neural networks, which are not very broad. So they're usually quite narrow. That means if I want to study object recognition, I have a specific network, I train this network, and that's it. So this network doesn't know anything besides learning some patterns in images to relate them, for example, to categories, to objects, for example, can say this is a human face, this is a dog, and so on. But it doesn't have really knowledge what these things it recognizes mean, what is behind them. This is quite narrow. It has not what Gary Marcus, which I will mention later also, calls, they lack often deep understanding. So deep learning needs deep understanding. And one way to go towards deep understanding is to make more complex, large-scale modular architectures. And that's actually what we want to do, so that the same network is not only learning one very narrow task, but that the very same network is forced, so to say, by architecture and especially learning and to really fulfill multiple functions. That's, I think, an important difference of cognitive architectures to narrow, for example, deep networks. Another important point is that we think that this cannot be done completely end-to-end. Because our brain learns completely different, like a deep neural network, where you have inputs and outputs and let then, by learning, shape the connections between all the millions and billions of neurons, simulated neurons in these deep learning networks. And therefore, I think we need to have an approach where you divide and conquer, where you say, okay, this part learns this part learns that, and get their training data from, for example, internal predictions, so that you don't have to train just anything internally from the input and the output relationship. And this is also important because what some modules learn in such networks can then be used as input or as knowledge for further learning in the system. So it's not learning always from scratch. That's probably part of the reason why deep learning networks often require millions of training data, where when you see kids learning, they also need a few hundreds maybe, but they learn much, much faster to get kind of the same accuracies in recognizing objects, for example. So therefore, that's another important point in cognitive architectures, that we try to divide and conquer, at least in the way we build these modules, these architectures, in a very modular way. And then very important for brain-inspired architectures is not that we don't trust that engineers can come up with systems which do what the system should do, to some extent at least, but we want to learn how the brain works. So I don't want to study a purely technically built system, because then I have the feeling it's too far away from the brain. If I build my networks and my models, my architectures, inspired as much as possible from what we know about the brain, then the hope is larger that what then the system adds to the bio-inspired architecture by learning is then enforced more to come out in a way which might be really related to fine-grained information of representations, which we can look for then also in the brain. So for me, that's very important for my work, that we do brain-inspired modular neural networks, and also embodied ones, because also embodiness is what biological organisms do, because they act in the environment to survive. And that requires, of course, also that models need to be acting, because otherwise, how can a system constrain meaningfully if it's just narrow and without any real causal effects, that it can act on something, learns from the consequences. These, I think, are important constraints of the behavioral aspects to really develop, hopefully, some representations which we can relate to the brain and learn about the brain. So the motivation, as said, is that we believe that modules, parts of a neural network has functions, has capacities. And that's to understand these, we cannot do this in isolation. We need to set them in a larger modular network and relate their functionality to what others do. So then we understand better what, for example, certain brain regions are doing. And I also talked about embodiment, the relevance for that. And that is very important. Of course, not everyone follows this reasoning, because many people say, if you start with only loosely constrained architectures and networks, you might not really learn much about the brain. We call this functional approach, teleological approach, top-down approach. They say you need to really model from bottom up. So you need to understand each cell type, each synapse, and then how small networks behave, and then you go upward, bottom up. That's, of course, fascinating. I like this very much. But I think it is very, very limited, because we cannot reach easily then the level of functions. So therefore, these networks are usually modeling only small pieces of the brain. The other point is, if we do it really at that level of detail, we might not come to, because of limited computational resources, we might not come to really performing networks. We might have very, very limited performance, toy problems, not real world problems. And that's what deep learning has taught us. It's exciting to really go with neuroscience into the real world. Robotics helps with that, but also deep learning helps with that as a tool for neuroscience. The other important point is, if we make too detailed models, we might not understand them anymore, because our brain has limited resources to really understand things. So if things are not made transparent to our limited cognitive resources, there might be a super nice system which does what humans would do, but we don't know how it does it, and we would maybe not trust it, which is a big problem in AI at the moment. the trustworthiness of artificial systems. So this is schematically shown here. We have this top-down approach and this bottom-up approach. And the top-down approach is what I will use for my two examples I present you. Although in the Human Brain Project, as probably many of you know, there are a lot of bottom-up models, also in my science work package. But my own work or my own interest is more in the top-down functional modeling. Why? Because we can really let it perform tasks which are human-level tasks. And we then say we do not need all biological realism. It might be at the end maybe too simplistic, but let's start with that and see what we can learn and do with that. And therefore, we have less computational resources necessary and can model larger systems of the brain. And we call this also the teleological approach, because we not just bottom-up model something, but we start from the top and say, we want to model how a system behaves in a realistic environment, seeing, hearing, acting, solving problems, moving objects around, navigating through space. This is the level we want to really have a system, that it really can be compared at this behavioral level, say, to some extent to humans. Of course, much poorer at the moment, but at least this is the goal. And therefore, we want to start by tasks and then assign to brain regions certain functions which help to fulfill certain tasks. And then look how they can learn certain functions. And this is exemplified here by this very nice work by Yammins and DiCarlo some years ago, 5 years ago. And there's lots of succeeding work in the same direction. And they called it not teleological like I call it, they called it goal-directed, but it's the same idea. The question is a bit, if we constrain convolutional deep networks, in his example here, to be built a bit similar like the visual system is built, with layers which correspond to brain regions, which have a hierarchical structure, for example, start in early visual cortex and go up to the inferior temporal cortex. Of course, there are also feedback connections, which are really important. Otherwise, you only get limited behavior. But the idea is even for feed-forward networks, if you use a convolutional network shown here at the lower part, and then basically model, constrain them that they have filter banks, which is now the standard of convolutional network, which are heavily inspired by the receptive fields of the visual cortex, that you not just fully connected layers, but that you have kind of filters which are similar across space. This is the success story of convolutional networks, especially for object recognition. And if you have a certain number of these layers and train them with the same task like object recognition, then you will see that the trained networks develop representations, these filters here, these stacked up here, which resemble almost at the same level in the brain. What we know, we don't know all these filters or representations in the brain, but at least for some areas like V1, we know that these are like oriented Gabor patches. And this is exactly what these networks develop by learning. If you just constrain them by the architecture and constrain them by the task, because you show them natural images and tell them what's in the image, right? And at the higher layers, you find in these networks much more complex, almost semantic representations for objects, so that the system can say that's a human face, or that's a dog, or this is a chair, things like that. And the idea is here that by not engineering all the representations by hand, which I tried in my PhD, which was at some point too simplistic approach, but that you constrain the architecture and the coarse connectivity, so to say, the pathways which are allowed to connect certain regions, inspired by the brain, then give the system a task which is behaviorally similar than in humans, of course, simplified a lot, but a little bit similar, as much as we can, and then train these networks. And then we look inside the network, because different from the brain, it is, against many people's opinion, pretty easy to analyze representations in these layers of these networks. And then we can look, do they resemble what we know in the brain? And maybe also they find something exciting, which we can then use as a new hypothesis that the brain might also work like that. And then we test it with neuroscience methods. This is a bit the approach here, and also the approach I'm personally pursuing at the moment. Now I want to just tell you that how important modularity is. Here, this Gary Marcus, here together with Ernest Davis, wrote a very nice critical book on AI, and criticized, like I said, the narrowness of AI and that it lacks word knowledge, that it doesn't learn several tasks and things like that. And here he stresses also that different to current neural nets, most of the approaches at least, the brain is highly structured, which we, of course, as brain scientists know. We see so many areas. We estimate there are about 200 specialized brain regions in the brain. And therefore, this is important basically to consider that. So the point is that if we follow that approach, we need to go not to tabula rasa, narrow networks, but to a modular structure. And each part of the structure should learn something which relates to what corresponding brain areas are doing. And these structures should be also connected in the way the brain is connected. I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So here is a little bit a sketch what that means. It is that this is like a sketch of a neural network, of a cognitive architecture, and the boxes here contain certain aspects, certain inputs, visual input and other input types, motor output, and internally, especially modules internally. And these are linked, as you see here in these colored boxes on this brain-like shape here, and connections are made, and there should be a correspondence. Because then when we train these networks and look what they do, we can relate it back to the corresponding regions and connections. This is the idea here. And we try then to recreate functionality to better understand the brain. This is our approach. And I give you now two examples. The first one is a brain-inspired architecture, visual motor architecture. So not yet high-level cognition, but still pretty interesting. And it is built to better understand how the brain understands scenes by doing saccades, namely to sample the environment in a goal-directed way, so that you, for example, make an eye movement to see things you wouldn't see if you wouldn't do an eye movement. But of course, I have not the time to go in all these different modules and how they work together. That can be seen in upcoming papers. But I want to focus just on one module now, because we already learned something very exciting from that one module for the brain. So I focus now only on a module, not on the whole architecture, because of time, because that is at the moment one of the modules we learned already a lot. So let me show you what I mean. Just also want to show you that our functional architectures are not always, each module is even implemented always in a neuronal way, but with different granularity. For example, you find that this is basically the saliency is built by an encoder, decoder, deep learning network. But we also have here, for example, for target selection, mean field approaches. We have for saccade generation, spiking neurons here. So I just want to say that this network, this architecture is heterogeneous. Not each module is implemented in the same level of detail. So now I go to the saliency model, and I will make it very short. I told you that we do, of course, saccades in the environment, as you know, to sample information, to bring the fovea, the part of our retina, which is responsible, sees best, most with highest accuracy, to bring information there. And in the saliency prediction model, we compared it a bit to a classic theory. And this is more an engineering type network where Itikhor and Niebuhr invented that. It's a very famous model. It's in textbooks. And it describes how a series of neural networks getting images as input analyze locally contrasts, feature contrasts like orientation, color, textures, and so on. And these feature contrasts are combined to a saliency map, which is supposed to be in the parietal cortex. So the early filters are in early visual cortex, and then the output is supposed to be in parietal cortex. And that system was for long, is still to some extent. We just published a paper on criticizing that a bit with our new insights, which I show you now. So the point is, what we did to learn about how the brain does saliency is, we used classical convolutional network, which gets natural images and then learns to say, in this case, there's a bird in this image. But we kind of, after training such a network, we removed the upper layers and added a decoder. But this decoder shouldn't predict the image itself, but it should learn to predict where humans look at. So we kind of trained them with the saliency map. In this case, the heat map here says, here's something exciting, and that is where the face, the head of this person is. And that's not just arbitrarily made. This is from tens of thousands of data where humans have made eye movements which were recorded when they saw these images. So this is really where humans look at. So we train it behaviorally in that way. And then what we found out is that our model, after training, makes predictions, which you see here. So it looks on screens, on the face and this screen, which looks almost identical than ground truth, which is the human data. And not just in one case, but in any new case. This runs actually on a robotics platform now, embedded in many systems, and predicts and looks around in a dynamic way. And the point is that what you see here, for example, this image is of course not used during training. So everything I show you now has been used only with new images. So what you see is the generalization performance of the saliency network. And you see here, it looks, of course, at all these cakes here and so on, like the humans do. Here it looks at the face like humans do. So this is the model. It looks at the face, but it also looks at the left like the humans. What is there? There is text to read. Humans like to read, if they can. So we assume this network maybe can a bit read, but of course it recognizes the letter shapes as a stimulus. And now I can show many examples, but I just want to show a few because of time, which basically indicate here the natural stimuli. Then what the classic model is doing, this is the Itty-Koch model, the still textbook model. And you see it looks, for example, here left at contrasts, where these lines run over, not at the face. The model misses the face. The model looks at things which are interesting, but it doesn't find, say, the core information. And if you look what our model is doing as compared to what humans are doing, you will be amazed how similar that is in new data. And we have now systematically compared this, and it completely outperforms the Itty-Koch model if you use natural images. Now, what we learned from that? Now comes the way back to the brain. The interesting point is that what we found out, what the difference is of our model, that by using the ventral stream in our simulation, so we had kept the learned model of object recognition, and the representations which are then there before the categories like dog, chair, and so on, had implicitly the knowledge about semantics, about high-level features at least, of the visual stimuli in the scene. So, and we kind of let it use this to basically predict the saliency, where salient information is. So the main difference is that our network got the chance to include semantic information. And that is the difference to the Itty-Koch model. So our model, as opposed to the Itty-Koch model, which goes from visual cortex to parietal cortex, our model predicts that the brain does more than that. The brain uses also what is called the WOT pathway, so the object recognition pathway, which was not supposed to go to IPS, because they're only like the where pathway, where something is and what features, what salient features are there. This goes to the parietal cortex. We predict, no, there is an addition, also an input from the ventral stream. That's what our model, that's the reason why our model performs so well, so human-like. And therefore, we now look in the brain whether we can find these new predicted connections. And we just run, because of COVID, it was delayed, but we now have started to run the experiments. So we will hopefully soon know whether this prediction is true. And if it is, it has two consequences. First, it shows we can learn from this modeling approach, really about the brain. And second, the textbooks have to be changed, because that is then the new model of how humans process saliency. At least it's a better model. Not saying it's the perfect model, but it's a better model. So that's all I want to show you for a first example. If I may, for 2-3 minutes, I would like to present a second example. And that's also a visual motor architecture where we basically use a commercial hand, a robotics hand. We have it in simulation, and we can also use it in physical ways. And that robotics hand, called Shadow Dexterous Hand, is used now to understand how humans do fine-grained finger movements and how they learn them. And I mean not only simple movements, like I will show you where we are at the moment, but also very complex ones. Imagine you want to open your door, you come home, and then you have your key hidden in several items in your pocket, and then you go with your hand in your pocket and you try to find the key. Then you might have it, and then you have to move it in your hand. The key, you have to manipulate the key, usually with one hand, such that the front part really goes front so that you can really put it inside the door lock. So therefore, this is a very, very high dexterous, high-level task humans can do quite effortlessly. And primates, some primates can do that, but it's a very high-level task which most animals cannot do. And that's why we selected it. We wanted to see how humans do these very complex tasks. So we basically have these 4 goals with this project. And one is that the system learns from a tabula rasa, nothing in the system, learns to make not just wild movements, just whatever, but it really learns first to use the fingers and move them in a coordinated way. This is the first thing we did, each finger independently. Then we learned finger opposition sequences. This is basically also completed. And now we are training, this is ongoing. We let the system learn like with the key so that you can manipulate objects in the hand. And the final one, we have not yet started in this project, is that the system does something like sign language, right? So you basically can let it make gestures. It learns certain gestures and then gets an input module, do this, do that, and then it produces these gestures. And how do we do it? We use not convolutional networks in the sense that you train them in a feed-forward way, but here we use fully recurrent reinforcement networks, which get some implicit rules which they can calculate reward from. For example, do not do this. If you let something falls out of your hand, then you get a punishment, right? And then the system tries to do movements with the fingers over time, which keep the object in the hand, just to give you an example. And this is reinforcement learning, which is very powerful, but in very deep networks also needs a lot of time, a lot of trials to learn something useful. So they're still not learning really as smart as humans learn. And we try to improve that. But now, what I show you now used a classical deep reinforcement learning approach, but in a very brain-inspired architecture. So one of this architecture is that the system sees the hand in the same way if you look at your hand and you see what it does, this input also the model gets. So it has the system you saw before, where our system can see what's happening in the scene. That system is kind of involved here in a slightly different way. Then it has touch. So when it touches something, the own fingers, for example, or objects in the hand, it gets feedback. Also proprioceptive feedback about the position of the fingers. All this is used in a human-like way. Like we used human saliency pictures to train the other model. Here we use like behavioral data to train this model, how humans learn this. Of course, humans learn faster. But in principle, the networks have to learn from the same input humans have to kind of learn this task. And here's the architecture, the brain-inspired architecture. It looks a bit dense, but it's just modeling very important structures like the motor cortex, motor commands for the robotic system to really move the fingers. It has a parietal cortex where it kind of learns to integrate vision and makes motor plans, actions. Sends this information to the motor system. We have a prefrontal system where we can basically give goal-directed instructions and cognition. This is still not done fully, but we work on this. But most parts you see, visual, parietal input, haptic input, proprioceptive input, this is all working already, and the system is trained. And now to come to an end, important point is here that we, as I said, first wanted that it learns from random motions to really learn goal-directed reaching movements, so that the finger, for example, the finger grip, that each index finger can move to the thumb, for example. And this is what we trained the system on. And we used some further goals and rules for the system. For example, that it is rewarded when fingers touch, but it's also rewarded when it minimizes muscle force. So we use also some more physical, coming from robotics, coming from how humans do actions, some additional constraints which are known. And we also put them in the reinforcement learning approach. And doing that, and you see here on the right side that the system indeed starts to do almost human-like looking hand movements, for example, here the fingers. And this was also recorded, brought together in a little animation, little movie. You see here our architecture driven by connectivity of the Jülich brain atlas. Then the architecture was further refined by functional knowledge. Then we run it on CSCS because it is quite a big network and needs so many trials. So we need supercomputing here from the Human Brain Project. And then you see here early stage where it just moves the fingers together, but not in a goal-directed way, finger by finger. And then in a later process, it starts to learn better and better. He's still not perfect. You see the thumb runs through. Now you see the thumb hits the target finger, which is the index finger at this point. So it starts to look more and more human-like. And now this is actually from the current work, we are already at training the in-hand object manipulation and making great progress there. Have not yet a movie, but if you go to the Human Brain Project Summit pretty soon, in 3 weeks, there we will show for the first time the first results of the in-hand object manipulation. So this is important because also there we learn a lot about how, because now we dissect the network and have already learned something about more complex representations, so-called primitives, motor primitives, which are developed by these in-hand object manipulation or finger movement networks already now. And we want to build the future learning on what these early stages have brought, so that you don't start again for in-hand object manipulation from an empty network, but you use the knowledge for the next module, for the next area, so to speak, that it can use that to learn more complex finger and hand movements. And this is a bit more human-like learning. You build on stages. This is what we learn now from this network, and we force it a bit also in that direction to become more human-like internally. I want to end and just mention that we also work with other team members in our project on more higher level cognitive tasks. Things like working memory, selective attention, but also solving pretty critical intelligence problems and hierarchical planning, lots of things. And at the end of the HOP or beyond, we do not know how far we come, but the system we built for EBRAINS, for the kind of infrastructural part of the Human Brain Project, we want to provide, and do this already, all this development such that people can also build on that and use that and continue making them even better with their own ideas and adding own modules, own functionality. And with that, I want to end my presentation. I thank you for your attention.